So today we're going to talk about the controversial novel Lolita by the Russian-American writer Vladimir Nabokov. Lolita was first published in 1955 in Paris and then later in the United States. But before I go into the novel, I would like to say a few things about its author, which I think you'll find illuminating. So here we go. Vladimir Nabokov was born in St. Petersburg, Russia in 1899, and he began writing in Russian. He continued to write in Russian even after he and his family moved to Berlin, Germany in 1919. He only began to write in English after settling in the United States in 1940. Now, Nabokov's life was marked by two important historical events. First, the Russian Revolution in 1917, after which his family fled to Germany, and then World War II, that saw him and his wife Vera becoming refugees in the United States. Nabokov also spent time in Crimea and London, but he mostly lived in Russia, Germany, the United States, and much later in Switzerland. Nabokov worked as an academic in the United States. His academic interests were wide-ranging, to say the least. He was a lecturer in Russian, but he was also into lepidoptery. Now, lepidoptery is the branch of entomology that deals with lepidopterans, which are moths and butterflies to you and me. In fact, Nabokov is said to have written Lolita while on a butterfly collecting trip in North America. Nabokov's most famous book is, without a doubt, Lolita. And it was thanks to that novel's commercial success that he was able to become a full-time writer. After Lolita's commercial success, Nabokov moved back to Europe, this time to Switzerland, where he spent the rest of his life and died in 1977 at the age of 78. Nabokov was trilingual and he wrote in his three languages, which were Russian, English, and French. And if you want to learn more about Nabokov's life, I think you should read his autobiography entitled Speak Memory. And another book I would recommend is Penin, which is a short comic novel about a Russian academic living in the United States, which must have been inspired by Nabokov's own experience as a, well, Russian academic living in the United States. By the way, I've linked to all the books I mentioned in this video review in the description box, so you can check that out after watching my review if you like. Now, going back to Lolita finally, I said right off the bat that this novel is controversial, so let me talk a bit about why the novel is considered as such by many people. So, Lolita is a novel told in the first person by its protagonist, a middle-aged, self-confessed pedophile who calls himself Humbert Humbert, and who becomes obsessed with a 12-year-old girl, Dolores Hayes, to whom he refers as Lolita. Humbert becomes Dolores' stepfather and then becomes sexually involved with her. And from that spoiler-free description, it is easy to see why some people would be put off reading Lolita. Now, far be it from me to tell anyone who feels like that they are wrong. But I am here to tell anyone who would listen to me that if you don't read Lolita, you are missing out on one of the best novels ever written, period. So Nabokov knew that the novel would be controversial, which is why, at first, he intended to publish it under a pseudonym. It took him, I think, about 5 years to write the novel and then 2 further years to find a publisher. All the important American publishing houses turned Lolita down. Finally, the novel was published in Paris by Olympia Press, which mostly specialized in erotic fiction, but also avant-garde fiction that was perhaps deemed to be too sexually explicit for mainstream publishing. So Lolita was banned in the United Kingdom, in the United States, and even in France at different times. And it is probably still banned in some countries around the world. And if you happen to be interested in this topic, in the topic of banned books, I made a video about it a while back in which I discussed the most famous books to have been banned mostly in the US, but also in other countries. So you'll find a link to that video in the description box as well, in case you're interested. So, okay. Despite all the controversies, Lolita is now, and has been for a while, widely available in mainstream editions. Some people consider its narrator and protagonist a rapist, while others see the novel as a love story. And just to be clear, I lean toward thinking him a rapist, and I do not see Lolita as a love story at all, okay? Having said all of that, I am less preoccupied with the controversial aspects of the novel and more interested in Nabokov's writing style. Nabokov is considered one of the greatest prose stylists in English in the 20th century. But how does a Russian writer become one of the great stylists in English? Well, despite not having been born or raised in an English-speaking country, Nabokov learned English from an early age. And that was not unusual for upper-class Russians before the Bolshevik Revolution. So Nabokov learned both English and French from early childhood, which served him very well when he had to flee Russia. Also, eventually, as we know, he earned his living writing in English. So I think all the money that the Nabokovs spent on foreign nannies for little Vova was money well spent. Because whatever you think about Lolita's controversial themes, there's no doubt that it is one of the best novels of the 20th century. Nabokov's style is refined, elegant even, but there are a few touches of telling vulgarity here and there, but I don't think it's ever obscene. Lolita, to me, is a novel void of any sentimentality or romanticism. It is also not the first book that Nabokov wrote in English. I don't want to give you that idea, but it was by far his greatest success. And a testament to its success is the fact that Lolita is one of those very few books that I think most people have heard about, even if they haven't read it. But I actually don't think that's a very good thing, because I have noticed that some people who have not read Lolita have a completely erroneous idea of what the novel is actually about, and particularly about the role of Dolores Haig's Lolita in the book. For many people who have not read the novel, Lolita is a sensual, they imagine she's a sensual young woman who seduces an older guy. And that's what the term Lolita has become to mean. For that, I do blame the movie adaptations and some of the book covers for the novel, but not the novel itself. And I say this as someone who loves the 1962 movie adaptation by Stanley Kubrick, starring, as you know, the great James Mason, Shelley Winters, who's amazing in it, Peter Sellers, incomparable, and Sue Lyon as Lolita. So if your idea of what Lolita the novel is like comes from the movie adaptations, even that excellent first adaptation by Kubrick, or by the book covers, or by second-hand references to it, I would plead with you to push all that aside and read the novel anyway. Also, if you think that Lolita is going to be too sexually explicit or shocking for you, let me tell you that if you have cable television or streaming or have watched a PG-13 movie in the last 30 years, there's nothing in Lolita that would shock you. Yes, it's true the novel caused all that controversy in the 1950s. But back then, as you know, Western society was a lot more prudish than we are now. Having said that, I also think that if you have never read Lolita and are not sure if the book is for you, I think I need to be clear about something. Lolita is not an obscene book. It is not pornographic. But I'm also convinced that we are now more aware, generally more aware of sexual abuse than people generally were in the 1950s. But Nabokov does not dwell on that aspect in the novel, and he's never explicit, never, about Humbert raping Lolita. As I said a moment ago, some readers don't even see Humbert as a rapist. It is possible to read the book and not see that, because it is all between the lines. So pedophilia is a taboo subject for many people, something they don't want to discuss or possibly even think about, but I do strongly believe that nothing should be taboo in literature. I believe that writers should be free and should feel free to write about everything they want, particularly if they can write half as well as Nabokov could, okay? So one of the most interesting things about Lolita is that the novel is told from Humbert's point of view. It is a first-person narration, and as it is often the case with first-person narrations, the narrator is unreliable. I mean, can we trust everything Humbert tells us in the novel? I don't think we can. I don't think we should even. We see Lolita through his eyes, through Humbert's eyes, but what about Dolores? We only get a glimpse of who Dolores is more or less in the second half of the novel, and it is only a glimpse, okay? And I think this is key. I think Lolita is how Humbert sees the girl. He sees Dolores as Lolita. And the reader knows from the start, or should know from the start, that the way Humbert looks at young girls is skewed, to say the least. So we shouldn't take any descriptions he makes of Lolita or of any of their encounters at face value. And that is, I think, one of the problems I have with movie adaptations of this novel. In the novel, we, readers, must imagine what Lolita is like from Humbert's descriptions, and we must know that we cannot trust him, right? So we cannot trust the way he sees things, the way he tells things. But in the movies, we are confronted with a Lolita of flesh and bone, which is always played by a much older actress than the 12-year-old girl that Dolores Haze is supposed to be when Humbert becomes her stepdad early in the novel. Humbert explains his attraction for what he calls nymphets early on in the novel, even before he meets Lolita in the narrative. So among other things, for him, nymphets must be between 12 and 14 years old. He has an extremely specific definition of what a nymphet is, and in his eyes, Dolores Haze fits that description to the letter when he first meets her. Humbert himself is a fascinating character because I think he belongs to that group of despicable characters that test the reader's empathy. Usually the first person is a narrative technique deployed to foster empathy in the reader's mind for the character who speaks, the character who tells his or her story. But when that technique, that first person narrative technique, is used with a despicable character like Humbert, readers become conflicted. And that is one of the best things that I think could happen when you read a novel, becoming conflicted and testing your own limits or the limits of your empathy. After all, it is easy to empathize with someone virtuous and attractive, but if a writer can make you empathize with someone truly contemptible, even for a moment, I think that is a huge achievement. And I think Nabokov manages that perfectly well in Lolita. So I mentioned in passing earlier that some readers see Lolita as a love story. I think that some readers, it's not my case, right? But I think some readers feel like Humbert was not just merely sexually obsessed with Dolores Haze, but also in love with her. I don't know if I would go as far as to say that, but I do think that Humbert has feelings for Lolita, for Dolores, and without spoiling the novel for anyone who hasn't read it, I think that we can see the fact that he has feelings for her later in the novel when he encounters Dolores as a young woman, and therefore she's no longer a nymphet, according to Humbert's own definition of what a nymphet is. But here, I would also point again to the unreliable nature of Humbert's narration. And I would ask you again, if you've read the novel, do you think that we should rely on what Humbert tells us about himself or Dolores, his Lolita? Because I do not. And there's also something else to this that I haven't talked about yet. The whole novel, Lolita, is structured as a long defense Humbert is making of himself in front of a jury. So he's writing his own defense for a jury to read. So he's supposed to be writing from jail, and he's trying to defend himself from a crime that is actually never defined. Okay, so we're not sure what the crime is. To me, that makes his point of view still more unreliable, because I'm sure you'd agree that very few people would describe themselves as monsters, particularly when they're trying to defend themselves before a jury. And it is also clear that Humbert, at least to me, I don't know if you would agree again, is one of the most cynical narrators in the history of literature, which only adds, of course, to his unreliability. Humbert's command of the English language, unlike mine, which is of course Nabokov's command of the language, is almost entrancing. So Humbert, the character, the narrator, is an extremely intelligent and educated man, which is why he doesn't need to do practically anything to seduce Dolores' mother and then become the girl's stepfather early in the novel. Again, this is not really a spoiler, this happens very early on in the novel. Now, Lolita can be read as an attempt at contrition by Humbert. I think that's a possible reading. Humbert, admits that he did what he did, but he tries to justify himself in part by how he describes Lolita. Now, how close his Lolita, the Lolita in his mind, the Lolita he talks about, is to Dolores Haze, the reader will never know, because all we have is Humbert's point of view and never hers. I think that if Lolita were narrated by Dolores, we might have seen Humbert more clearly as a serial rapist of children. But we can't see him as that, because that book just doesn't exist, or at least Nabokov didn't write it, right? So what exists, what Nabokov wrote, is Humbert's account, which is refined, compelling, and even funny at times. If you haven't read it, Lolita is a funny book as well. And what it's not at all repulsive, as people who refuse to read the novel may think. People who have read the novel know that it's nothing like that.